Okay, we're good to go.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's Energy Dialogue. I see we're still waiting for more participants to enter, so I wonder whether we can just give it a few more, 1 more minute as more attendees start to enter before we begin. Okay, good morning all, and welcome to today's Energy Dialogue. My name is Zainab Sedan, a PCC Commissioner and a political strategist at WWF South Africa. Today, I'll be facilitating the dialogue, and this dialogue is really centered around South Africa's electricity sector, which is undergoing a system reform and one that is quite fundamental. Um, this is really about how the country is progressing from a state-dominated or Eskom-dominated electricity system towards a more competitive wholesale electricity market that can support energy security, but also support the country's developmental and economic growth commitments and decarbonization objectives. Now, today's discussion will focus on the transitional market arrangements and specifically the transitional generation pricing and vesting contracts, which can support the emergence of this competitive wholesale electricity market, while also ensuring the affordability, the investment certainty, and most importantly, a just transition towards a low carbon economy and society. Now, these issues are quite technical. And so we have a few introduction presentations that will really help us just to wrap our heads around it, but also start to pose some of the questions that should stimulate our thinking. And this particular issue is also currently under consultation through NERSA, and this will feed into that discussions going forward. Now, in today's dialogue, we actually want to explore the rationale behind this system reform while understanding the different frameworks that are being proposed and examining the implications on affordability, on competition and investment, but also gathering some of the stakeholder recommendations. So just to give you a quick outline of today's session, we'll start with a framing presentation by the PCC Secretariat. We'll then have two presentations, one from NERSA, who will outline the transitional generation pricing and vesting contract framework, and then one from Sustainable Energy Africa, which will really explore the implications for the just transition in South Africa. And then finally, we'll follow by a round of reflections from PCC commissioners, providing perspectives from labor, civil society, the technology and energy sector, as well as the financial sector. And now, then we'll have discussion. So we'll be using the Q&A function in Zoom. So if you're familiar with that, you can please use that function to ask your questions to the different speakers during the session. But we'll also have a facilitated session right at the end where we'll field some questions from the audiences and between the speakers. Okay. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Simphiwe Ngwenya, who's a senior manager for climate mitigation in the PCC Secretariat, and she'll really give us the framing of the electricity system reform. So over to you, Simphiwe.
Thank you, Zainab, for that intro. Good morning, everyone that is on the call, especially just to mention the PCC commissioners. Thank you for joining us today. So my task today is to really set the scene and do the framing for today's webinar. And so as I do that framing, I will be providing context on the PCC work and the evolution of the PCC's electricity power sector work, as well as work that is being done to date, and seeing how this particular piece of work actually that is, being presented by NERSA interfaces with the work that the PCC is doing. And so I have an agenda, an overarching agenda. It's 4 slides: the PCC overall purpose, the historical context, and the PCC's research and webinar aim, as I have mentioned. Um, And so, just to give some background on the purpose of the PCC research, which many of you are probably familiar with, but it is, especially in the power sector, it is really to make the case for a strategically managed transition, especially in the power sector. And so we do this by analyzing the structural pressures on the power sector because of global and local geopolitics, the climate commitments, and the end goal, which is the just transition. And thus positioning South Africa such that it is in a position to benefit from the energy transition and managing any risks that could arise, but also taking advantage of the opportunities in a well-structured and timeless manner. And so we also advise on policy per the Climate Change Act. And how we do that is by delivering evidence-based advisory positions on the policy, the financial, industrial and social interventions. And all of this, as we do all of this, we are cognizant of the quantum of people living in poverty in South Africa, the inequality, as well as the levels of unemployment. And so to ensure that we are addressing this triple bottom line as we make these recommendations, particularly on the power sector reforms and reducing emissions therein. And so just some historical context: the PCC made recommendations on electricity planning. I think this was in 2023, and several recommendations were made. A spatial planning approach was recommended towards, the allocation of renewables because of grid limitations, investment in upgrading and expanding grid infrastructure. So this is both transmission and distribution, as well as a major study into pricing reform in a transparent and participatory manner, and the need to alleviate energy poverty. And so the just transition has to also be a central focus in the short and long-term planning, particularly in the power sector. And so also incorporating recommendations such as creating additional jobs, to create additional jobs, government should incentivize green industrial development, economic diversification, and the localization of key value chains. And, the last recommendation was around seeking opportunities to support a just energy transition as we incorporate renewables within the grid. Hence, for example, the PCC welcomes national strategies such as the Cabinet's approved South African Renewable Energy Master Plan that is aimed at local industrialization, job creation, and manufacturing. And so in order for us to meet, our climate commitments, our NDCs that are cabinet approved and submitted internationally, it does hinge on our ability to decarbonize the power sector. And so emanating from the PCC recommendations were several key pieces of work that the PCC has undertaken over the years to date. To start was a roundtable discussion on business models to address South Africa's grid infrastructure requirements, really doing a deep dive on, the models, on the various models that can support grid expansion, and then making a submission to the NTCSA. Following this, the PCC, together with the National Planning Commission, the SA Tide, as well as the DBSA, commissioned work to understand South Africa's energy sector investment requirements to achieve energy security and net zero by 2050. And so these are all important because achieving net zero by 2050 in a changing environment that incorporates a more diverse mix of energy compared to what we have now will require investment, but it requires structural, rethinking of our overall energy sector. We have also commissioned a detailed study to be done that was done on grid readiness and renewable energy integration. So what we refer to as our grid studies to understand the capacity or the hosting capacity of South Africa's national grid, and whether or not or what interventions would need to be to be implemented in order for the grid to be able to host the increasing amount of renewables. And so that grid studies examines how South Africa can better integrate transmission constraints, renewable resource location, system flexibility, and stability considerations into long-term mitigation planning. It also links geospatial capacity expansion, unit commitment, and power flow modeling to assess how grid realities affect South Africa's future mitigation plans. There are several findings that are being incorporated into a PCC recommendations report, but safe to say grid constraints change the relative value of renewable resources. Once transmission and connection costs are included, solar PV tends to shift closer to demand centers, while scarce transmission capacity is better reserved for higher yield resources in more remote locations. My colleague Jürgen is in the process of finalizing this work, and I am certain it will undergo a process of public engagement. And then the last piece of work I would like to talk about is the PCC's electricity pricing and sector reform work. This piece of work was really important because as you integrate renewables, the pricing structures changed, and then which has then implications not only for the electricity supply industry, for the distribution industry as well. And so these electricity pricing and sector reform papers try and answer the question of how do we enable the required investment in our electricity sector, fairly recover costs, and ensure that all South Africans remain included. This work was supported by Sustainable Energy Africa, and Megan is on the call today, and she might touch on this with her inputs. And so just going back to the pricing series of papers. So this work is important because electricity pricing is a critical lever for attracting investment. A reliable power system depends on sustained capital investment, which in turn requires predictable and adequate returns. In parallel, mechanisms must be in place for social inclusion through affordable access. And so this work explores the electricity basics and pricing trajectory and the intertwined system changes underway to achieve the goals of energy security, sustainability, equity, and efficiency. And the goal was to really equip policymakers and social partners to engage with the transition with a focus on ensuring that the most vulnerable are not left behind. In particular, indigent households should not be left behind as we reconfigure the overall pricing. And so moving on to today's webinar. So vesting contracts are one transitional component of the shift from a monopoly to a competitive and more liberalized wholesale market. The PCC is a multi-stakeholder body, and as a multi-stakeholder body, the PCC seeks to capacitate stakeholders to be able to grapple with these key issues strategically. And so it is important that the debate around these technical issues is socialized. The PCC aims to support the work underway by government to identify strategies on how to manage the looming stranded asset cost bill from an affordability perspective. The consumer alone cannot bear this cost, especially the poor. And then transitional generation pricing and vesting contracts are one of the biggest single lever we have. The design should leave room for merit order dispatch and fair price discovery. And thus, a transparent system is key to enable a power sector that enables us to meet our climate commitments, but also ensures a just energy transition is realized. But several processes are to happen in parallel to enable the realization of a just transformation of the electricity system and support a more liberalized energy market. We are already seeing efforts from government, for example, the revised electricity pricing policy for public comment, the current work, the vested contracts the transitional and vested contracts work that we are engaging on today, as well as the establishment of an independent transmission system operator. And so just acknowledging that there is lots of work underway. However, there is still lots of work to be implemented and to be done. But as all of this happens, it's important that those that are most vulnerable are not left behind, but equally so, the stakeholders are capacitated so that they're able to make comments into the public processes. That is me. Thank you. Thank you, Zainab.
Thank you very much, Simpiwe, for highlighting all the work that has gone into this over the years. And as you said, there's so much more to be done. And the electricity sector has been a household topic actually over the last couple of years, and that won't necessarily change, especially now as we are opening up into a more wholesale market. And so this conversation today is quite interesting, not only from a consumer perspective, but for the private sector, for investors, and of course for labor in terms of how the transition will actually take place. I see on the chat, there's so many different stakeholders in the room, so I do encourage more of you to share who you are and which organization you are representing, where you're coming from. We're at 95 participants on this webinar, so I'm looking forward to a really good, robust discussion and hearing all the different perspectives on this. Now, without further ado, I do want to introduce our speaker, Mr. Mark Beer. Mr. Mark Beer is a strategic advisor and full-time regulator at NERSA. He'll be introducing the proposed transitional generation pricing and vesting contract frameworks. Now, quite a technical topic, and hopefully Mark will really enlighten us into what the proposal is and how this will impact the electricity sector. Thank you. Over to you, Mark.
Good morning. Good morning, everybody. I'm going to make a slight last-minute adjustment to something. First, let me share. Okay. Right. Is it sharing now? And just to confirm, I have 20 minutes, correct?
Yes, you do.
Right. So what you should be seeing on your screen now is the Electricity Regulation Act as amended. And I wanted to start off by quoting the objective, out of the objectives of the Act, Objective B. And that is, you can read it there. I'm not going to go through it word for word. But essentially what it says is that consumers must be protected, having regard, not subject to, but having regard to the governance efficiency, etc., and the long-term sustainability of the industry. So this is a very powerful objective in terms of protecting consumers and making sure that the outcomes of the implementation of the Act take this into account. So now I'm going to just switch to my presentation. I thought I'd do that. So there it is. I'm not going to read the title slide. A very quick disclaimer. Why am I making the disclaimer? Because the regulator is 9 people, and those 9 people make decisions. And until they make a decision, the rest is conjecture. So, for example, my presentation today is an interpretation of what we understand the future will look like and some of the impacts thereof. But until the vesting contract framework is actually approved, there is no decision on the table. And therefore, the best that I can do is try and provide some guidance as to how to understand the vesting contracts framework paper. Where do we start? Well, let's look at where energy comes. What's the role of energy? And we need to look firstly at what does the demand profile look like. And I know that some of this is probably going to seem a bit trite, but I thought it was a good place to start. So we have the demand profile, the role of energy in the economy, labor, transport, feedstocks, regulation, etc. We have a number of, those are all guided by the principles behind South Africa's government being a developmental state. These are then through the various regulatory and policy instruments. You mentioned a couple there, but of course the most important one is the ERA that was amended on the 1st of January 2025 that then incorporated the move towards a competitive market. What do we want out of that? Well, let's look at what the equitable outcomes should be, looking at the various elements, the market operator, the rules, the systems, the vesting contracts, wholesale tariff, and the affordable prices. So we want economic development as one of our equitable outcomes. And for that, we need efficient and affordable tariffs or competitive tariffs. And the reason for this slide, as I say, is simply to contextualize where are these changes coming from a broader techno-economic perspective. If we then look at what is the market intended to look like, at the moment we have a market that is largely captured in the market code, the design of the market. And I'll come back to that a bit later. And if we look at that, the main purpose of this slide, and I must acknowledge I didn't have time to get it in there, but the diagram in pink and yellow is actually an extract from a presentation done by CPCS. But the reason I wanted to show it is that if you look at the red block that I highlighted over here, that's where you can see the vesting contracts mentioned and the relationship between the upstream and the downstream vesting contracts within the context of the South African wholesale energy market, which is marked over here. And then on the side, on the left, you can see one of the important principles to keep in mind is that the guiding competitive thinking behind the regulatory framework in the South African electricity or power market space is that you stimulate competition in the generation side and you stimulate competition in the retail side. The access to market, i.e. the transmission and distribution, they should not be driving any part of the access other than to make sure that that access is equitable and fair. So the principle underlying all of that is that in generation and retail, you're wanting to promote or incentivize competition in the market. And then for your transmission and your distribution, which will remain regulated for the foreseeable future and has in most other jurisdictions around the world, you want to deter competition for the market. So it's about promoting access, non-discrimination, etc. These are very important underlying principles because the issue of transmission has been mentioned already, and the need to understand that that capacity in the infrastructure is also an important element of the market and access to market. And if there isn't enough infrastructure, then we have big problems with accessing the market, which will then dampen the competition both within the generation and in the retail sector. What are the anticipations, therefore, from this future market? Well, I've just highlighted a couple of the broad elements. So these are just some broad brushstrokes of what the market should look like. So you'll have a transmission system operator, TSO. So the system operator will manage capacity remuneration and ancillary services. In the day-ahead market, the market operator will clear the market and manage the intraday market, which is where the rest of the balancing of the system takes place on a repetitive basis up until real time. And then when we get to real time, then we're talking about the system operator actually then balances the market in real time and then sends back those balancing results to the market operator to say who actually was needed to actually keep the market balanced. The key function of the reforms is to do two things. One, it's to bring price discovery, which then brings liquidity to the market, but it's also to bring governance, because if people don't trust the market, then they won't play in the market. And for those that don't have that luxury of being market participants by choice, because they are captive customers, we need to make sure that they are protected from abuse. So some of the core characteristics that we are expecting from this future market is we want a stable transmission grid. We're looking at how the market is dispatched centrally. This is an important point because we have a market design that is very decentralized in its design, in the way that it was many of the underlying concepts were developed, but actually we have a centralized dispatching market, which is more like the US markets than it is the European markets. So this is an important point. We want transparent market rules, an independent TSO, very important, and everybody's, I'm sure, aware of the ERTT, the Eskom Restructuring Task Team, which is focusing very, very intently on this independence issue. We need grid capacity, and it must be readily available. We also need the capacity in the generation sector, which must also be readily available and flexible. We want a liquid electricity market, which is, again, goes back to the price discovery. If there is weak price discovery, you're unlikely to have a strong liquidity in the market. We need to build trust. I mentioned that. But we also, very importantly, we need to mitigate against the abuse of market power by a big incumbent such as Eskom. So we're faced with a bit of a conflicted or tension that we want to bring Eskom into the market because we need their liquidity, we need their power, their electrons, but at the same time we accept the fact that they're a very powerful player, and therefore there must be strong governance in place to avoid the abuse of that market power. So this is the objectives that we're having to try and understand here. On the one hand, we're trying to make sure we get a balanced electricity market in SEWIM, but at the same time, as a development state, we want to know that we can deliver on our development plan. And this all sits on that fulcrum of the integrated power system, and balancing that system then becomes really important, not just in terms of the electrons from a techno-economics perspective, but also from a political perspective. So what are some of the key enablers? Well, we're looking at the latest policy, which is just released, I think it was last week, the electricity sector market transformation position paper. It's a very important paper because that talks to the design of the market and the future expectations of the market, which then provides a framework for everybody, including ourselves, at the regulator, as to how to then evaluate, are we being successful with the regulatory instruments that we regularly approve. The TDP, the Transmission Development Plan, the Integrated Resource Plan, the latest one, the Market Code and the trading rules, the Eskom Restructuring Task Team I mentioned, and these capacity investing agreements. So as you can see, where I'm going with this is each slide starts to bring in this thread of the vesting contracts, but also the capacity agreements that are in place. And then the question is, why do I keep talking about vesting and capacity together? Well, this slide hopefully will clarify that. What are the vesting contracts? Well, they are an energy compensation or an energy hedge, and to all intents and purposes are regulated CFDs, or contracts for difference. And so that's what they're intended to do, compensate for the energy. They're an enabling instrument. Without it, Eskom doesn't come into the market, and then 88% of the power is not available via the market. They're there to leverage the Eskom plants individually, one by one. They'll each have a vesting contract so that we have a proper competition between those plants. As I said earlier, the purpose is to improve price discovery and liquidity, and also to mitigate against Eskom's abuse of market power. And I'll come back to that a little bit later. I think what's important, though, is what they are not. They don't compensate for capacity directly. There's an inferred compensation for capacity in the inframarginal rent, and I'll come to that in the next slide. They will not solve Eskom's debt issues, nor will they solve the municipal debt crisis. They will not recover stranded costs because it's an energy hedge. It's nothing more, nothing less. And they're not a permanent solution. At some point, the proper competition in the wholesale market will have to happen. What is the big risk? So let me look at the diagram first. So you can see the vesting contracts then feed into the system marginal price. And I hope some of this is not too small, but the presentation will be available. That the vesting contracts then feed into the system marginal price, or the single marginal price, which will be the universal price that the market operator will use to clear. And then the CPA, the Central Purchasing Agency, will then play in the market as the balance responsible party for all of the legacy IPPs, the REAP IPPs. It will also, at that point, deal with Eskom's capacity power purchase agreements, which is where they will be compensated for their capacity. And also, when the single marginal price is not equal to the strike price or the price that's sitting in the vesting contracts, well, then the CPA then puts a levy into the market to make Eskom whole. This is where that concept of the CFD comes in. So if the price is high in the market, Eskom pays back. If the price in the market is low, Eskom gets made whole via a levy that goes into the wholesale price. And then, of course, you can see the system margin. These levies, together with the system marginal price, then feed into the wholesale tariff, which is another paper that's out for consultation, but which I'm not going to go into at this stage, except to say that this will then form the foundation for all customers. That when you take power out of the grid, whether you're doing that privately or publicly, your baseline will be your wholesale market, so that any of these costs that are associated with enabling the market through these levies, like the REAP IPPs, for example, that everybody is actually paying, that those costs are socialized and not left to the burden of only those people who are sitting on the grid. What is important here is that the legislation separates the vesting contracts from the capacity PPAs. But for Eskom, this is essentially just two different sides of the same coin. It's recovery of its revenue, which until 2028 is designated via the MYPD6 pricing program, pricing ecosystem. What is the risk? If the vesting contracts are set too high, then Eskom gets a windfall, and if the prices are set too low, then Eskom has an embedded predatory price built into its vesting contracts. With regard to the windfall risk, there is a mechanism already in the code that basically puts a cap on the price. So if Eskom goes above its strike price, I think there's a variation of 5%, I think. And the purpose of that is simply to reward a little bit of flexibility where it's necessary. But essentially, if it's like 50% higher, they will pay back that extra windfall. They won't get it. Whereas the too low is a more of a problem, because if it's locked into the vesting contract, then it becomes almost like an embedded predatory price into the market. So how does this play out? Now I'm going to go into a little bit of technicality here, but I don't want to go too deep. How am I doing for time?
You have 4 minutes left.
Okay, and I've got two more slides. So very quickly, let's look at the left-hand side of this screen, the windfall profit. What happens there is if the strike price is inefficiently set too high, and I'm showing that, I don't know how to make a red dot on Adobe, but if you look at my cursor, you can see it there. So if that yellow line there is too high, then you can see that Eskom will collect inframarginal rent, i.e. the rent that's above its marginal price. But because we've got the regulatory mechanism of a revenue or price cap built in, they'll get that marginal rent, but that inframarginal rent, but they'll have to pay it back. Now, the other reason why this concept of the inframarginal rent is important, and perhaps I'll go to the right-hand side of the screen where it's a bit clearer. But what you can see effectively in the left-hand side is that where the vesting contract prices are inefficiently set, then there is a risk that there's an over-recovery. And you can see the green and the brown here set correctly for each of the different generators. What happens when that price is set too low? Well, it upsets the supply curve. In other words, if Eskom's vesting contract is set too low, it actually jumps to the front of the queue in terms of dispatch or clearing of the market and then later dispatch. And therefore pushes out, as you can see here, pushes out maybe some of the renewables. That then pushes out the OCGTs at the end here that are the most expensive. But the important difference here is if you looked at the demand over here, the way it's stacked up here, your battery and storage and was inside the demand curve. So therefore, there was they would get dispatched at the highest price when necessary to normally to balance the market. Over here, because more electricity has been dispatched at a lower Western contract price, the BESS has been pushed out of the market, and therefore the OCGT is setting the market price, not BESS, and therefore that disincentivizes investments in BESS if that risk is sitting in the market. So I won't go into much more detail there, except to say that the regulatory mechanism for this is to make sure that those vesting contracts and those capacity PPAs are properly approved. The reason, so what I want to come to here is the reason why, actually, let me, before I go, see this inframarginal rent. Basically, for your renewable energy players, they bid into the market very low because their marginal cost is very low, but they get this large inframarginal rent based on what the most expensive bid into the market is. And that is inferred to be their recovery of their capacity charge, where they pay for the long-term capacity. But it's a short-term energy market that is inferring a long-term capacity, which is a problem, because capacity incentives worldwide or capacity remuneration mechanisms are long-term. So I've sat on a number of platforms over the past year, and I think the key takeaways from that talk to this issue of the inframarginal rent that is remunerating capacity when actually it's a short-term energy market concept in the SOM that is then runs some serious risks. So SOM's success is very sensitive to the retirement of the coal plants. And of course, the retirement of the coal plants is then signaled by the underlying regulatory engines, such as the vesting contracts and these power purchase agreements for capacity. The longer they are, the longer they push out the retirement of the coal plants. The big issue, though, is that there's an uncertainty over the recovery of Eskom's marginal costs via these capacity PPAs. For example, Eskom is lobbying at the moment that its take-or-pay coal contracts are a fixed cost, not a variable cost, even though they are a fuel cost, and therefore they believe they should be recovered as capacity. What that means is what I showed in the previous, that once they've got their energy price is dropped because those costs are recovered via the capacity PPAs, that gives them this predatory, enables them to be predatory in the market in the way that they are done here. They did there. With increasing levels of variable renewable energy in the market, being compensated both their energy and their capacity via the inframarginal rent, there is a real risk that with the long-term inter-renewable energy competition, as we're already seeing during the day here and we're seeing in Europe, there's a price cannibalization that puts a serious revenue risk on the table for these investors as the S&P drops lower and lower during the middle of the day, for example, when solar comes on. The biggest challenge is that if we are remunerating capacity through these inframarginal rents on a short-term basis, we run the risk of dampening the long-term capacity signal. That means the capacity won't get built, and then we end up with the situation that when the system operator needs that capacity, when it needs it flexibly, reliably, etc., all of these become very important words in the modern power world, and it's not there, then we run the risk that we head back into load shedding. And globally, reliability and flexibility are becoming paramount, with increasingly prioritized over just installed megawatts when it comes to capacity. So I've got a quote there from a document I wrote recently. You can read it. Basically, what I'm saying is that if there's an ambiguous capacity remuneration signal in the market, it's likely we won't get capacity investments, and we then run the risk of heading back into load shedding. And the system operator won't have any option. If there's no capacity available, the only way to balance the grid is to shed the load. So the key takeaway that's come away from this, and I've spent a month in Europe studying power markets, is that the one missing piece of the jigsaw at the moment is the capacity remuneration mechanism. We're already seeing that in the transmission side, where we're having to try and find a way of signaling that. But for generation, it's going to become critically important. Otherwise, we really risk that by 2035, we may well have load shedding again. And it'll be a more efficient signal than the Section 34 process, which is a bit blunt, as nobody, one isn't sure that the procurement process is producing the most efficient outcome. We've seen that with the REAP bid rounds in the beginning, very high prices, very overly risk adjusted to get those prices, which are now way above what you're seeing in the later rounds. So a capacity remuneration mechanism and in Europe, they're looking at more probabilistic mechanisms where they can start to model reliability and flexibility as opposed to just getting more megawatts into the system. So I think at this point, that is as quickly as I can quickly contextualize the vesting contracts. Hopefully that will enable you to then read the consultation paper with a little bit more insight. And I thank you for the opportunity to present. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mark. And we did give you just a little more time to get into that technical detail. And what I found really important that you mentioned right up front when you showed the objectives of the Act in terms of consumer protection, and also the reminder of the principles that's necessary in terms of stimulating market competition in generation and retail. However, ensuring that transmission and distribution remains equitable and fair. And I think that's quite important, while ensuring the governance structures to mitigate the abuse of market power, but also to ensure stability is still achieved. So thank you very much. And just a reminder for all the participants, especially those who have joined later, to please share your questions directed to Mark and to the later speakers in the Q&A. Mark, there's quite a number of questions already in the Q&A section if you'd like to start answering those directly. And we'll then move on to our next speaker. So the next speaker will really touch on the electricity system reform in terms of the implications for the just transition. And this is Ms. Megan Houston-Brown, the Director of Sustainable Energy Africa, which is an NPO that's dedicated to supporting sustainable energy transitions over the last 25 years. So over to you, Megan.
Thanks, Commissioner Zainab. And a warm welcome to everybody in the room. Pretty cold in Cape Town. Hope you are all warm. I'm going to, I guess in a way, take a little bit of a step back from where Mark left you off. Mark's was obviously quite a deep dive into the technicalities of market reform and locating vesting contracts within that. And to some extent, I'm going to try and sort of locate them in almost like a bigger picture. I've been asked to kind of frame the discussion a little bit in the justice lens. So I wanted to just start with the notion that affordable or access to affordable energy is obviously a really key element of justice. And it's an interesting one because it's a much more of a system level, or what the just transition describes as distributional justice. And there's obviously elements of restorative justice there as well. Free basic services were set up very much as a process of distribution, redistribution of wealth in South Africa. And I think what's really interesting in this Cape Town statistic that a colleague of mine developed for his PhD is that you get income inequality at the moment in the city of Cape Town. It was the only city he did this for in South Africa, sitting at a 0.7, which is still remaining pretty high. And electricity usage, the inequality there is quite a bit lower at 0.4. And it describes a situation where there's been a successful redistribution of wealth, or at least more successful than the kind of economic redistribution has been. And I think that's really interesting. Interestingly enough, he was using this in a PhD that was looking at other African cities where it in fact was the inverse, where there's less inequality but much greater energy inequality. So it really says that our program of access to affordable energy in this country has been impressive, and it's something we really need to look at retaining, as it is at the moment it's on relatively shaky legs or under a bit of threat. So we'll get to that, and that's not to do with market reform. So I'll hopefully make that point. And I wanted to, Simpiwe, I think you really framed this really well for me, but I wanted, as a kind of way of framing the discussion, to just look at the notion that reliability and affordability in electricity are not separate debates. So we often get politicians talking about affordability. We must reduce the cost, the price of electricity. But there's this kind of decoupling it from the whole reliability issue. So I just wanted to quickly raise that. So when we talk reliability, we're talking about that the ability of the economy or the electricity system to supply electricity to people and, of course, to the economy. And as Simpiwe said, that's really dependent on the investment flowing into the electricity system, and that all the costs of operating that system are covered. And we know in this country from firsthand experience that reliability has real economic implications. So we saw with load shedding something like 15 GDP points were lost and 800,000 jobs were lost within the sort of crisis 3 years between 2020 and 23. So real economic implications. And then on the other side of the picture, we have the issue of affordability. And I think it's important to remember that affordability is not just a function of the price of electricity. It's the relationship between price and household income or functioning of the economy. So when the economy is not working and households' income is not rising, even if electricity prices were stable, you would still get greater affordability crisis or energy poverty, as we'd say. And then, of course, affordability is critical to being able to pay for electricity, which then leads back to reliability. So this is not really an equation that can be solved, but it's a set of interrelationships that are unfortunately quite unviable. So when a politician says we'll cut the price of electricity, we really have to ask the question of who is going to then bear the cost of that, and then what are the subsequent implications of that. So it sort of means that there are no silver bullets, and the conversations have to be quite mature, and they have to be made, any solution is going to be some sort of compact over time. Given that the costs for the electricity system can only be raised either through tariffs or through taxes. So someone pays somewhere along the line. Okay, so coming in a little bit closer to vesting contracts themselves, to start with just the fact that wholesale decisions dominate. So as kind of citizens in the country, very often we only see electricity pricing at the point where it engages us. And there's a sort of sense that municipalities are the problem, and that they, slap on extra charges, and that's why electricity is so expensive. It's really important that if we look at the whole electricity supply chain, we become very aware that wholesale prices are roughly about 80% of that value chain, with the distribution component at about 20%. So really wholesale decisions, and at this stage, this is really, we're talking Eskom generation, currently dominate the pricing and will into the foreseeable future. Then I quickly want to take you through the different types of energy, the components that we pay for in the energy system that are becoming increasingly unbundled. So we have energy, the energy charge. You can see there, it's sort of the biggest component there. We have these, what Mark referred to as capacity or availability charges. And these are sort of a combination of, being able to have the size of the network scaled for what we need, but importantly, backing capacity so that we can produce the power we need on demand at the maximum demand at any one point. There's the networks themselves, and those run through transmission and distribution. And then lastly, the kind of billing and metering and what you might call the retail element of it, which is taking that wholesale and giving it across to customers at the other end, running it through our networks. And those become a little bit important in looking at the vesting contract space. So it's a useful one for people to understand. Okay, so how do we establish the cost, and where is the kind of transition element? And, Mark's presentation really was a lot more sophisticated. So I'm kind of asking you to forgive me on this kind of a little bit of a simpler look at things. Where are we coming from at the moment? So at the moment we sit under, regulated tariffs. And an interesting little fact is that if it's regulated, it's called a tariff, and if it's not regulated, it's called a price. So under a regulated tariff regime, as we currently are, all, and I put in brackets, efficient costs, and that's where the regulator comes in. They assess those costs and determine whether they are efficient. We as the public are also invited to engage in that discussion. They're kind of summed, and that's your operational costs, your fuel costs included in all of that, your wages and salaries, and then your capital costs, which are your depreciation, and under regulated tariffs, the interest on loans. And in a regulated tariff, capital is paid for through depreciation, but also this rate of return, which is a kind of a way of mimicking the market. So you get a return on your investment, but there's no actual investment signal. And this is one of the critical differences between a regulated space and the market. So you will get that regardless, whether it's a good investment or a bad investment. You will still get that return on your asset base. It's very stable and predictable, and I think that's why people are a little bit nostalgic about this, because you know what you're going to get. You sum it up over the year, and you know where it's going. And of course, it doesn't always match what happens in the real world, and there's a process of what's called a clawback, or a sort of a readjustment process, but essentially fairly stable and predictable in the short term. On the other side, which we're moving to, is this what's called a kind of a market-based price discovery. And this is really that price is discovered through the kind of classical supply and demand scenario. So at times, sort of middle of the day, where there's tons of sunlight and there's lots of solar, you're going to get a very low price. And come the evening when the sun has disappeared and you've got to run your more expensive and dispatchable power stations, the price goes up. The theory is that this provides the kind of marginal costing pricing investment signal. So where there's a kind of a profit to be made in the evenings, people will try and innovate and come up with new technology that provides cheaper power in those kind of valuable times, and that's meant to push the overall cost of the system down, which is called allocative efficiency. So it's not as though the energy produced is any cheaper than it would be under a state system, but it's that the investment decisions are meant to be more efficient because of the investment signals and the price, the marginal pricing. It's potentially quite a bit more volatile. But I think it's important just to note a couple of things. So the one is that under the regulated tariffs, because a lot of people think, oh, well, why are we moving to this complicated system? I wanted to just say the one thing is that the regulated tariffs are not a socialized system. I think it's important. They were set up post-94 as electricity was set up as a trading service with a subsidy component to establish the social component of it. It is meant to reflect the real costs of production and the costs of capital. It's also important to note that it's not, it has seen a 900% increase since 2008. So it's not as though it's without risk. So when I said it's stable, it's definitely not without risk. So, once you get political interference, that delayed investment, and so on, and you can have huge challenges, and the risk sits with the customer. So no one else is going to pay for it. Eskom doesn't go bust as such. We as a taxpayer pick it up and we pay for it. So the customer really is at the greatest risk there. I think the other thing to say is that no matter what your ideological kind of ideas are about this, there is already a market. So that is really the nature of renewable energy. And it's actually an amazing thing in some ways, which is that it's a technology that's highly scalable. So instead of concentrating power, it disperses it. And a lot of this new market that's already out there is kind of behind the meter. So it's not as though anyone could even control it or put it back in the box. Anyone's allowed to do, put it on their roof, solar PV. So it's already happening. And because it's happening in a situation where there is participation in both markets, so someone with access to capital can put up a small solar PV and utilize it or buy through a wheeling contract. But whenever it goes down, they're able to jump back into the regulated tariff space and get this kind of average or blended price. So you get a kind of slight pricing triage happening. It's not huge, partly because Eskom has become more and more sophisticated at its pricing game. And what it reflects in its MYPD, the multi-year price determination, is almost reflective of how a market would be pricing. So it's not a huge discrepancy, but there is certainly some degree of lack of fairness there. So in a way, we have no choice but to move to the market. And what vesting contracts are doing is that they're bringing some of the regulated tariff pricing elements across into the market. So how does that really work? Well, it's kind of guaranteeing to Eskom, Eskom did its investments under a regulated regime. It's not like it chose what power to produce. And it would be extremely unfair to just throw the gates open and expose it to a market price. It would be risky for the whole country. So we're bringing them into the market. We're bringing them in under that more regulated pricing regime. And I think Mark described the hedging process well, but basically, there's an agreed upon a price with Eskom, and that's set up through the multi-year pricing determination through the regulator's agreed price. And where the market is below, then the CPA will pay the power plant to make up that difference. And where it's above, in a sense, the power plant pays the CPA the excess. So they don't make any windfall, they make a predetermined set tariff based on their operational costs. That's how it works. So what are some of the potential affordability risks within the current vesting framework? And these are really simple, and I think very much based on the sense that the vesting process is very critical to establishing the market and offering the kind of stability we need as we get the early immature market underway. I think one of the risks that we should take note of is that the kind of vesting strike price benchmark is derived from the MYPD 6, so the latest Eskom pricing document. And this is, based on quite high costs as the reference point. So Eskom's prices at the moment are fairly high cost. And it means that we won't, as consumers, benefit from competition until that vesting falls entirely away. So we're kind of subject, in a way, to the inefficiencies of the regulated market. And those inefficiencies have got, there are multiple things that fed into that, but we're kind of subject to that until vesting falls away. So that's obviously an element of inefficiency we're carrying through. I think this has been talked about a little bit, but what is considered capacity or fixed versus the energy costs? So it makes sense for Eskom to kind of push quite a lot of their energy costs into the capacity side, which they'll get as sort of guaranteed capacity contracts, and it means they can bid pretty low into the wholesale market, and that could be a bit detrimental to the market there. The other thing is that, as Mark said, there's a contract with every Eskom generator, and there's not really a differentiation between good and bad plant. And so how do we kind of incentivize the inefficient plants with very low efficiency to retire? So we need to think about maybe a better design approach there. I'm really not going to take you through this hugely complicated slide, except to point to the bottom and say, so as customers, what do we see? We buy either from Eskom distribution or we buy from municipalities. Some municipalities will participate in the market and be buying at a market price, and they may themselves enter a hedging contract with the CPA to kind of mitigate price impact there. Some municipalities may buy from a trader. Traders are also able to kind of smooth prices a little bit because they're, buying and selling for multiple players. And then Eskom distribution, the idea is that Eskom distribution will buy from the market, but there would also be a hedging contract there so that they get a slightly smooth price. So as it comes down to customers, then the municipalities on-sell at a regulated price to customers. Ultimately, there's likely to be retail competition, and that will change, but currently it will come down to customers through a regulated price through NERSA. So we're seeing that it'll be sort of smoothed a couple of times before it reaches the customer, and with that smoothing is it means it's much less volatile, much less risky, but it also carries a fair bit of inefficiency. So it means that the ideally the efficiency of the market will take a little bit longer to be realized. Okay, coming then to the affordability side, I think it is important to state front and center that electricity is already unaffordable for many South African households. So what you can see here is energy affordability is usually energy as a percentage of income. So how much do you spend on electricity relative to your household income? And we can see there that 16% of households are already, deep in energy poverty, and then we get the middle income bands, which are already at risk at 8 and 6%. They're at risk of falling into energy poverty. So this is a serious thing, but I think really important to say that this stems from before any market transition. It's got nothing to do with the introduction of renewable energy into the space, and everything to do with quite a lot of inefficient state contracts that we've seen and the impact of load shedding. Okay, so then going back to how do we deal with affordability? As we said, for the system to work, we have to cover costs. The electricity pricing policy, the review document has just come out, but I'm referring back to how it was set up and how our subsidy system was set up in electricity. Was that there would then be subsidy integration so that poor households would be protected. And there's a couple of things to say here. So I just wanted to say this is built off a couple of years ago, but essentially what we call the kind of revenue affordability gap sits at about 65. I mean, it establishes the revenue affordability gap. But the cost of supplying electricity into low-income households is about 65 billion on an annual basis. How do we recover that cost? 38 billion is recovered through tariffs, and that's a really, really important building block in this equation. So the revenue affordability gap sits over there. So it's it's about 30 billion. That is currently 1.5 billion is covered through the FBE grant, and it's so little because a lot of the FBE is not making its way to households, and this is a chronic problem. Unfortunately, it's complex, so people often just simply point the finger at municipal governance, but it's a fair bit more complicated than that. As electricity prices have increased, many households have gone essentially off-grid through bypassing the kind of formal connection. They're still receiving electricity, but the municipality is no longer able to call down that FBE for them. So the money gets wasted. There's also where Eskom distribution areas, there's a kind of often a mismatch between how the municipality is allocating that grant and how Eskom is prepared to allocate that grant. I know that in one or two big metros, there's billions of rands is not getting through to households because of that mismatch in those service delivery agreements. There was also the introduction of indigent registers, which the first year was seemingly okay, but you have to re-register on an annual basis, and we've just seen a massive falling away of households. So a huge piece of work to get the already dedicated money to reach municipalities and ultimately, of course, poor households. But there remains this amount. Even if that FBE was fully there, there's an amount of cross subsidy, which is at the moment about 16 billion. And this is really where the risk in the system lies, because with the move to alternatives and the move to market, it's harder and harder to raise a cross subsidy because you can't sort of smooth it over the entire tariff, and those customers are already being subject to higher and higher prices. It also has a huge impact on the economy. So if you go back to my that frame that you can if electricity prices, as we saw last year, went up by roughly, I think Eskom's wholesale price went up by about 12%. If prices are kept low for low-income households, it means that the commercial and manufacturing sector is paying quite a lot more than 15% increases in their electricity, and ultimately it becomes untenable economically. So this cross-subsidy is fairly under threat and it needs to be addressed. So in kind of conclusion, what we're looking at in terms of the tariff pathway is that we've seen a 900% increase over the last 15 years. So there's an enormous pressure. We know that tariffs at the moment are currently under recovering costs. So we still actually need to be higher in terms of recovering what we need for the good and reliable functioning of our electricity system. So even though while there are efficiencies to be squeezed in the system, even when one weighs that in, we're still slightly under recovering. Over the long term, renewable energy and the market may introduce some efficiency, but there are many other factors pushing these costs upward. Tariffs are already unaffordable, and subsidies are not being adequately integrated, and the cross-subsidy element really needs to be addressed. So what do we need to do? And here are just 4 thoughts. And the overarching thought is really that we need a kind of a national tariff pathway and a political and social compact around pricing. We're going to have to maintain higher average tariffs in the short term in order to stabilize the system. And this is really with or without the market. And who bears that cost has got to be addressed. It can't be ignored. And if we just ignore it and in a way silently cannibalize the infrastructure, ultimately down the line, the system starts to collapse. And that, as I started out the introduction saying, is that has huge economic impacts and ultimately, of course, then affects affordability. We do hope for cheaper electricity in the long term through these better generation choices and governance. And I say associated accountability because whether it's the market or the state, if we are not accountable for our decisions in the electricity sector, we can drift. So, even things like we might say we're going to not give the full kind of cost increase that's required. We need to monitor that over the time so that the gap doesn't just widen and widen and widen. We need to make sure that we are slowly closing that gap. We need to be reporting on these things all the time. If we ask commerce or manufacturing or higher income customers to carry a disproportionate part of the burden in order to protect low income households in our society, we need to be accountable around that. We need to ask it transparently. We need to really show that poor people are getting the benefit. We need to show that there is an eye also to economic performance, which is the other side of that coin. So going back to the legacy costs, we need to, we need to have that vesting space. It needs to be transparent. We need to make sure that there is constant monitoring of it. I would also suggest that this gets into quite complex territory and a little bit like the integrated resource plan. Not every single citizen can undertake energy modeling. I would suggest that as society, as stakeholders, as civil societies, we need to develop capacity amongst independent commentators who can provide us with sort of reliable, trustworthy kind of feedback on what is happening in the space. These contracts will come to the regulator, whether it's quarterly or annually, and the regulator will be looking at them. And I think as society, we should be supporting that process, participating in it, but understanding that it's pretty complex. And, we need to develop that muscle to engage, and that's going to be quite a specialized story. Let's get our kind of trusted emissaries in place. And then lastly, we've got to make sure that we have really effective and strong targeted subsidies for poor households. So we need to make sure that poor households are brought back into the fold. Many of them have been forced off the grid because of pricing, and by off the grid I mean the sort of the legal connection, and in a sense criminalized. They don't want to be there. It's not an ideal situation by any means for them, let alone for the country as a whole. So we need to get that right, and that's not there's no silver bullet. It's a kind of a 5 to 10 year project. There are multiple different challenges, and each one needs to be, met in its surrounding context. Thanks. That's all I've got for now.
Thank you very much, Megan. And I guess just to touch on a few of the issues that you brought up in terms of affordability, I hope that later we'll also get to touch on how this reform can also address some of the cost externalities on the environment, and how we can also contribute to transitioning towards the low carbon economy. So not only take into account our technical economic processes, but also ensuring that we contribute to social, developmental, and then importantly, our climate commitments as well. So with that, I'd like to now introduce the next section of our dialogue, which is really to hear some reflections from PCC commissioners. So I'm going to invite to provide her perspectives, Ms. Boitumelo Molete, Social Development Policy Coordinator and Organized Lead in terms of COSATU. So over to you, Boitumelo, to provide your perspectives to this discussion.
Thank you very much, Commissioner, and good morning to the colleagues on the call. I think just very encouraging to have listened to Megan's perspective in terms of electricity pricing. It really much aligns with where COSATU is in terms of this discussion. It's very important that we really focus on the aspects of energy democracy, affordability, and how the social aspect of this needs to be attended to as much as we are speaking to the tariffs. I think it's important that we really understand that electricity is at the heart of our economy, and it definitely powers our industry, schools, hospitals, mines, farms, etc. The success or failure of electricity is really going to depend on a proper reform, which has to be thought of through wanting to establish an energy future that is secure, and an energy future that allows for us to build our economy. We're quite aware that this just transition brings a lot of changes, and in that we need to make sure that we are investing adequately to ensuring that we have a just and equitable transition, focusing on aspects that rely on the perspective of the working class being at the center of the injustices of electricity poverty. So from COSATU's perspective, we can't reform by simply using this exercise as a market-based exercise. It's important that aspects of development must be addressed. It must be that we are able to, through this, create jobs that are decent, that we build industries, and that we are able to expand the affordability of electricity, which then will strengthen public institutions, and it will meet our climate commitments simultaneously in the future. So for us, a just transition must be about transitioning into sustainable jobs and green jobs that are going to be able to achieve a just and equitable transition for workers. While we know that we're facing high levels of poverty, unemployment, and inequality, we are really supposed to really focus on ensuring that we are building a future that is resilient. And as COSATU, we are simply saying that it's not about reducing emissions, it's really about transforming the economy, while we are also ensuring that the basic needs of our communities, of our workers, are actually being attended to. So we really want to focus on ensuring that this electricity reform that we envision drives green industrialization, that this just transition to a low carbon economy presents another opportunity for South Africa to industrialize and to ensure that no one is left behind. So it's not about simply moving away from fossil fuels or moving away from intensive technologies. It's really about adapting these renewable energies to ensure that they are able to sustain a grid that will cater for South Africans. An electricity market reform must therefore be explicit. It must be comprehensively covering the importance of green innovation and green technology, but as well as industrial diversification. We are very clear as COSATU that there are other aspects that we need to focus on while we are speaking about this reform, and that specifically speaks to workers and communities alike. We need to be able to also advocate and speak about the positioning of workers as the central aspect of this transition. Issues like skills, issues like upskilling need to be addressed in a way that will be able to ensure that workers are also participating beyond just being at the end of it as consumers. So for us, the success of an electricity reform is not going to be measured only by the wholesale electricity market. It will be measured by how we are able to create decent jobs. It will be measured by how we revitalize South Africa's manufacturing sector, how we are also promoting localization through this renewable energy value chain, and also reducing the cost of electricity and ensuring that principles like energy democracy, principles like free basic electricity are actually being accommodated for, so that communities and workers are also able to be transitioned in a way that is fair, in a way that is just, and in a way that will allow for them to be able to have sustainable lives. So the electricity market of the future must not only power a grid, it must build resilience, it must create a green industrialization, employment, inclusive growth, as well as shared prosperity. So we must ensure that this transition is not only moving to a low carbon economy, but it's centered around development, it's centered around workers, communities, and those at this point that are at the forefront of actually experiencing adversities when it comes to energy poverty. We do know that while we are encouraging and speaking about how the Department of Electricity has achieved the partial eradication of load shedding, communities and workers are still very much experiencing load reduction, which is another form of energy oppression. And if you look at the dynamic of the electricity load reduction, you would see that the areas that are usually affected by this are areas that are previously disadvantaged, and that they are the ones that are bearing the burden of this crisis when it comes to electricity poverty. So we are really wanting to make sure that the essence of the just transition is captured as envisioned by COSATU, that no one is left behind, that it's inclusive, it's equitable, and it allows for communities and workers to be considered as central, but also considered through this future. Thank you very much, Commissioner.
Thank you very much, Commissioner Boitumelo, and thank you for sharing those kind of additional aspects of how we should measure success of this electricity reform. I'd now like to welcome Dr. Titus Mate, also Commissioner and CEO of Technology Innovation Agency, TIA, and is no stranger to the energy sector. So Dr. Titus Mate, if you will share your perspectives in terms of any additions we also need to consider in this discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Commissioner Zaina. Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Okay. I'll try and be brief. I was making some notes, but let me start by appreciating the three presentations from Simpiwe, Mark, and Megan. I think to me, they were emphasizing more or less the same message. Simpiwe, she spoke about no one should be left behind. So as we reform the electricity supply industry, we must ensure that no one is left behind. And then Mark spoke about or highlighted what's indicated in the Act, that consumers must be protected. And then my takeaway from Megan's presentation is that electricity is currently unaffordable. Of course, there are various ideas in terms of how to take care of the low-income citizens of the country, including re-looking at the free basic electricity subsidy. But then someone else must pay. I understood that in her presentation, she is indicating that the high income earners as well as industry must pay, but also that has got negative implications. So I think my takeaway really, I just want to zoom in into only two things. I was looking forward to seeing modeling that has been done to support whatever scenario, whatever direction that we want to take as part of the electricity system reforms. I still don't see it. We have to, whatever we do, must be informed by a credible data. I think Megan spoke about we need to utilize the experts that are out there to help us navigate the direction that we want to take. On top of that, I will add that we need credible data, verifiable data by independent entities and organizations. We had a similar experience when we were looking at the IRP. The conclusion of that whole process was that let's establish a completely independent body in the country that will gather all the necessary energy data that we will need as we revisit the IRP 2025 going forward. And then we need to allow the experts to do proper modeling to inform the decision and the policies that we take going forward. So the same applies to what NERSA is currently busy with. For me, I'm failing to see credible data. I'm failing to see a scientific approach to what is being proposed. And I'm failing to see the outcome of the modeling done by credible experts in the field. And I think that's something that we need to look into. The issue of pricing, that's a second point that I want to raise, Zainab, before I stop talking. Let me just elaborate on the issue of pricing. And I think it was raised throughout by all the presenters. Maybe before I go there, let me make it clear, as a commissioner, I am fully behind supporting electricity system reforms in the country. However, this must be done under the following conditions. First of all, the system must continue to be reliable. We must not impact negatively on energy security. Also, the system reforms must not lead to unaffordable electricity, as the other speakers have said. It must not lead to us not meeting climate change goals as a country. It must also not lead to increase in inequality and poverty. It must also lead to increase in economic growth. We're currently growing at 1%. It cannot be, it's not sustainable. So whatever we do with the market reform, electricity market reforms, it must lead to us increasing our economic growth to the levels of 3% or even above 3%. It must also not lead to deindustrialization. As we speak, we're busy deindustrializing the country. Factories are leaving the country. We're not attracting as much as people that are leaving the country. So this, whatever system reforms that we're talking about, it must not lead to deindustrialization going forward. I see the electricity price, we have to come up with innovative ways of how to stop it. But I see the electricity price going up. First of all, we have to invest in massive transmission infrastructure. The cost of capital, as we know, is very high, especially for Africa. Someone must pay for it. The IRP calls for massive investment in new generation capacity. The cost of capital for that new electricity capacity is going to cost the country money. At least for the next 5 to 10 years, we're going to be paying a lot of money, increasing the generation capacity and infrastructure for the country. We're also not alone. There are other countries that are planning to continue building new electricity infrastructure. So we are in the back of the queue. So for us to be in the front of the queue, we'll have to pay a premium. So that will contribute to increase in electricity price. Some of the energy solutions that we're proposing, it's going to depend on importation of energy sources such as gas. As you know, what has happened in the last 3 years or so globally, the price of gas has gone up. So this is going to impact as we pursue gas to power. It's going to increase the electricity price in South Africa. And then, of course, we have to continue supporting Eskom, doing maintenance and also compliance with the quality emission standards, etc. That costs money. So we still have to pay for that. So I really don't see the cost of electricity price going down. And I also don't see the rich citizens of the country continuing to subsidize the low-income earners. So even if the FPE is increased to 200 kilowatt hour, I don't see that making a big difference. So we need to put our heads together, get the experts in the room, get credible data, do more modeling for us to be able to make informed decisions going forward. Let me stop there for now, Zainab, but I really wanted to emphasize the issue of electricity pricing going forward, that we need a credible modeling, scientific approach, data, and also get the experts to help us navigate what we need to do going forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mati, for raising those important issues on data, but also on how this should inform pricing. And so perhaps some members of the audience have been involved in some of the research or ongoing work. If you would like to share some of those that's already contributing to the discourse. And of course, as Simpiwe mentioned, all the PCC pieces of research that's gone into this already. But of course, the work has not been finished yet. So the next speaker I'd like to invite to provide some perspectives is Commissioner and Dr. Pindile Masangane from the DBSA, with expertise and so much experience in the energy sector as well. So I'll invite Dr. Masangane to the stage. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Commissioner Zainab, for the kind introduction. This was such an insightful presentation, and let me start by being honest that I have not yet read the publications. I've read the documents from the Commission, making the case about why our market structure is changing. So this I found very, very insightful, and therefore would be able to informatively contribute to the dialogue when it comes to the PCC. My takeaway from what both Mark said and then Megan tried to simplify it to the level where an average person can grasp what these reforms are about, is that this is essentially, as we have more players coming in to provide electricity generation capacity and selling directly to intensive electricity users in the market, we need to now start to look at Eskom's MYPD methodology and how then we determine its tariff relative to what the market is doing. I found that very, very insightful. I also was encouraged when I heard one of the speakers, I think it was Megan, starting to tease out what the role of the municipalities would be in this changing electricity market. What was important for me was that these reforms are starting at the wholesale market size before we come and see them as consumers on the retail. This is one of the things, and I've been in the electricity sector since 2006, so for more than 20 years, and I kept asking myself, how is the average consumer or user of electricity at a household level going to cope with this changing electricity market pricing methodologies? So it's really encouraging to hear that this will start at a wholesale level before we start bringing them down to the consumer level. And this is where I have to agree with Dr. Mate. So one of the things that I then started asking myself is, will the way we are introducing these reforms give us an opportunity to correct in the event that the methodology we've gone through does not yield the results that we want? What results are those? It's results where the pricing methodologies that we are introducing encourage new investment in the sector. New investments that will help us to decarbonize, because that's where the world is going, but also importantly, help us to make sure that our utility is sustainable. The reforms should not be about taking Eskom out of the market, but making sure that Eskom is efficient in the market. So I'm hoping that the way we will introduce the reforms, Mark, and I'm glad to have the regulator participating here, will be such that if the methodology that we've chosen is not yielding those results of encouraging new investment, stabilizing price, and giving us a smooth pricing and predictable pricing, if it doesn't go that way, we'll have a way of self-correcting. I also think it's very, very important as South Africa that we do not just copy what other countries and regions are doing, because we've got our own unique circumstances, but rather we learn and we compare the different methodologies. And that's where, for me, the issue of data becomes important. One, to monitor the price paths, the investments as they come when we introduce this new methodology, but to pick up a methodology that is suitable for South Africa. From this, actually, Megan, when you spoke to affordability, the even inefficiencies that we have in terms of the use of our free basic electricity, I thought this is actually a quick win that we must have as a country. We don't have to wait for the reforms to be embedded for us to address the shortcomings of the free basic electricity instruments that we have. For example, you were mentioning that indigent houses have to register every year to participate in the scheme. That's nonsensical, honestly speaking. Someone must address these inefficiencies and make sure that we safeguard the poorest of the poor in South Africa. So yeah, very encouraging to hear this, and I look forward now to reading this draft documents extensively from the regulator, so that as the commission we can provide our inputs. Thank you so much, Zainab. Very insightful presentations. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. And now to our last commissioner who will provide his reflections, Mr. Errol Andile Mlambo from Earth Life Africa. Commissioner, over to you to provide your perspectives.
Thank you so much, Commissioner Zainab, and thank you to the speakers and the presenters who gave much needed an overview on the work that we're doing right now. You know, before we start, I thought I wanted to share before, I segue to my reflection. There's this African proverb in Ghana, which is called Sankofa, meaning before you know where you're going, you must know where you come from. And I thought we should reflect, a bit, with Sankofa. We take a moment just to, go back in time to understand, why are we here? Why are we having this conversation? And then the answer to that is that in 2022, the president announced an energy action plan. And that energy action plan, I think, has really brought us where we are. And why did we have that energy action plan? It was because we were facing, prolonged load shedding. I think we ended up at some point, we even reached to stage 6. So I thought, I should share that, so that when I give a reflection on how we should anticipate the future, especially as a civil society practitioner, just give meat to the conversation and the insights by all the experts and the commissions which I spoke now. So the EAP, the Energy Action Plan that was announced by the president in 2022, had 5 critical pillars, and I'm just going to list them, briefly. The first one was that we need to fix Eskom and improve the availability of existing supply. The second one was to enable and accelerate private investment in generation capacity. The third one is to accelerate the procurement of new capacity from renewables, gas and battery storage. And the fourth one, was to unleash business and households to invest in rooftop solar, which we've seen in communities. The rollout has been positive. And then lastly and fundamentally, which brings us to why we're having this conversation, it was to transform the electricity sector to achieve long-term energy security. So I thought, I should share this so that, we have an understanding, as participants, as commissioners, say, as we are responding to the EAP, now that we know what caused the problem and what was the policy regulation that was set up in 2022, how do we move forward? From a civil society perspective, I think the best thing is to have safeguards. And how do we look at those safeguards? And the safeguards will be if you're going to have a electricity sector reform, and we must look at both the opportunities and the risks that local communities will face. Because if you're going to have reforms such as unbundling the electricity sector, allowing private generation, expanding renewable energy, strengthening municipal electricity distribution, and creating a competitive electricity market, how can we improve the sector? So I thought I should take the opportunity to list, what conversations are being had on the ground before we have a consultation, so that we build safeguards that can be embedded in the policies that we are influencing right now, so that we know that moving forward, we can have this taken into consideration as we plan, at the earliest, not responding at the later stage where, now things are out of control, the prices are out of control, the FBE is not affordable, as the previous speaker was saying. So I think, I thought, let me share this, so one of the fears that are raised by communities is, one, the high electricity costs. Market-based pricing may increase the tariffs, making electricity less affordable to poor households. Note that. Number two, job losses. Communities depend on, especially those who are depending on coal mining and coal-fired power stations, may lose jobs without adequate transition plans. Three, unequal distribution of benefits, which speaks to the three justices, which, the PCC carries, meaning, wealthier communities may benefit first while rural and informal settlements continue to experience poor services. Next one, limited community participation. Decisions are often made without meaningful consultations, the operative word being meaningful, meaning there's been times where there will be consultations, but they may not be much, meaningful. I like Dr. Pindile spoke about the MYPD as well, to say if you're going to have consultations on the increase of prices by NESA, is that meaningful? Are those recommendations by communities taken forward? Another one, land use conflicts. Solar and wind projects may compete with agriculture, grazing land and culturally significant sites if poorly. The planning is done very poorly. So those are the issues and the fears that are taking place in communities. Great infrastructure challenges. Many communities remain far from transition infrastructure, which delays the access to new generation projects. Municipal revenue losses. Reduced electricity sales may weaken municipal finances, which will affect delivery of other public services. One which is very important, skills mismatch. Many workers from, for instance, the coal sector may not have the qualifications needed for renewable energy jobs without retraining. So these are the things that must be factored into. These are the fears that are happening to the community in communities when we're having conversations about their reform, and pricing. Let me add two more. And there's the risk of energy inequality. Households are unable to afford, who are not able to afford, rooftop solar or backup systems, may become increasingly disadvantaged. And then last one, social disruptions. Communities who are reliant on coal-related, economic activity may experience, declining local business, which can lead to other things, which is going to be migration and reduced, municipal revenue. So for us, colleagues, is for us to consider that when you think market reform, you must also think at the core, you must think the just transition. There must be a balance, as we move forward, so that for electricity sector to reform and to benefit local communities, the things that we should prioritize, for instance, one, meaningful community consultations throughout planning and implementation, affordable electricity tariffs and protection for low-income households, retraining and reskilling programs for call workers, very key. Investment in local economic diversification, community ownership, socially owned renewable energy projects, which speaks to benefit sharing in the projects, right? Expansion of transmission and distribution infrastructure to underserved communities. Strong social protection measures for affected workers and households, local procurement and support for small, medium, and macro enterprises, the SMMEs, and environmental and social safeguards that protect livelihoods and land rights, biodiversity. And lastly, transparent monitoring of reform outcomes with community participation. And I think, colleagues, before I close, those are very key priorities that we should take forward, as we plan and we focus to the future, so that in every policy document, when we are speaking to it, we include those recommendations by communities. We speak to them prior consultations, and we speak to them post consultation to hear their views and how much are they impacted and how much those voices are included in decision making. And just to close, from a community perspective, I think electricity sector reform should not only be judged by whether it ends load shedding or it attracts private investment. Success should also be measured by reduction of energy poverty, creation of decent and sustainable jobs, keeping electricity affordable has been reiterated a lot in the call, and give communities a meaningful voice in decision making, and protect workers and in coal-dependent communities. And lastly, ensure that the benefits of the energy transition are shared equitably rather than concentrated among large investors. And I thought ultimately, we must think that the electricity sector reform, can contribute to a more resilient and sustainable energy system, but only if it is implemented as part of the just transition that places people and communities at the center of policy, investment, and implementation. And I think with that, Commissioner Zainab, I would like to end. But very key is that, I applaud the PCC's move and stance to always be inclusive and include everybody. But that should not be seen as a rhetoric. We want to see it happening also on the ground. We must want to see it in practice as well, to say when we take the recommendations from communities, when there's consultations, but we see them come to life and actioned in policy documents. With that, Commissioner, thank you very much. Back to you.
Thank you very much, Commissioner Mlambo. And I think all speakers today, all four commissioners, but also from the presentations we heard earlier, we had a mix of the technical, the data that informed the policy advice. And so I kind of picked out 3 themes that emerged. The first is around policy coherence. So we're trying to ensure that we have an evidence-based, transparent, and inclusive policy process in order to inform green industrialization, our national development priorities, ensuring that we're also addressing decarbonization and also climate adaptation, because at the end of the day, it comes down to that lived experience on the ground. That brings me to the second area or theme is around this economic opportunities, around decent work, around upskilling and ensuring social protection for communities and SMMEs. And then finally, the lived experience on the ground. How do we ensure affordability, energy access, but also energy security? So we have this rich kind of base through which to make an informed opinion. And so I wonder, as you sit there as the audience, how you formulate your opinions that may be still early on, or it may be actually fully formed. So thank you to all the speakers who provided those insights. We will now head into a section where the audience is able to pose questions and also provide some of your inputs and perspectives to this dialogue. So we're going to take a few of them now. We have about 10 to 15 minutes, and you can just raise your hand if you'd like to make an intervention or ask a question to any of the speakers. and then we'll have some reflections back from the speakers as well. So I'll give you a few moments to raise your hands if you'd like to make an intervention. I see one already. It's King Khumalo Mudwa, followed by Soli Rampisa. So over to you. The first speaker, King Khumalo Mudwa.
Okay, thank you very much, Chairperson.
Okay,
Thank you for the presentations. They were informative. Thank you for the informative presentations. My question is, as we do the just transition, those who are in the value chain, have they considered the issues of accessibility as well as availability of electricity for township dwellers and backyard dwellers in the farming areas?
Thank you very much for that question. I'm going to take a few more just so that our speakers have a chance to react or respond. And if you have a specific question, if you can please direct it at a specific speaker as well. So the next hand that I noted was Soli Rampisa. Over to you.
Good morning or good day. Yeah. Well, it can be deemed to be questions, but it's just concerns, questions that are having concerns. For example, I heard one of the speakers speaking about the reforms and then reprimanded us to say what were the reforms all about. Now, my question is that I want to know that whose interest does these reforms serve? Because now we've got a community that is expecting service delivery, and then we've got the government that is sort of like enclaved to what the world is eyeing at doing, or for example, is eyeing at the question of transformation in this regard, that we're using coal, electricity, derogating from coal now, and then is the world, is not us that are saying we must go to green energy. Is the world that tells us that we must go to green energy. And then at the end of the day, you find that there is an interest challenge that I'm having or that I'm facing now to say, by the way, when we talk about the question of the reforms, specifically, if we are honest, actually, maybe let me say that also, if we are honest, whose interest does this reform serve between the community and those people who have a means of dictating to some of the governments to be able to apply that? And then the other thing is, when I was listening to all the speakers, yes, there are similarities on the speakers. But now, when you talk about the question of transformation, in particular, for example, whereby the government convinced us that no, Eskom has to be transformed. While at the end of the day, it was not all of us who participated in identifying the weakness and the threats of Eskom, but it was the government. Now, Eskom has to be transformed in a sense that we need to whether to import or to export, to import other people who can be able to generate electricity. Within that confusion of Eskom, or within that challenges that we have experienced from Eskom, then you bring somebody externally now to come and compete with Eskom, and we want to pretend to say those people, no, they are not there to let Eskom go down, but they are there to, it's like they are motivating that Eskom must pick up their socks. I thank you.
Thank you very much for that, for raising the concerns, but also there is a question there, is whose interests are being served, but also how are community interests taken into consideration here. So I don't see any other hands. So I'm going to ask our speakers who would like to comment on these two questions from the floor. And this wasn't necessarily addressed to one speaker, and so I'd actually pose it to you. If Mark and Megan, you'd like to go first, and then we'll take some reflections from commissioners. Mark, would you like to come in first, followed by me?
Yeah, apologies, Zainab. I'm not sure which question I've been trying to respond to questions in writing, so I'm not sure which one you're talking about.
So these were the ones posed just now by the two speakers. So the one is around electricity availability to backyard dwellers and to communities.
Wow.
And then the other one is around how community interests are actually being taken into consideration here, both in terms of this electricity reform, but also the decisions around Eskom and the move to renewables.
Okay. With regard to, firstly, today I was prepared to speak on the vesting contracts and the role of the vesting contracts. So I'll make some general comments, but keeping in mind they are probably more my understanding on a personal level. With regard to the reforms, I think I did note one of the comments that was raised about the need to have a greater level of community engagement, and I think that talks to part of the way of dealing with this, to make sure that we do extend the consultation around the reforms. Let's keep in mind that the reforms won't happen on one day. We'll press a button and it'll all happen. There will be a trigger point, and then after that trigger point, there will probably be a 5 to 10, maybe even longer period over which the market will mature and interventions will be made to deal with areas of market failure, socioeconomic issues and outcomes from the market, etc. But I think with regard to the dealing with, for example, if you look at the unbundling of Eskom, the restructuring of Eskom, there were always going to be two elements to that restructuring, and I think Dr. Pendile Sangwani, she pointed to that, and that is we've got to find that pragmatic balance between introducing competition where it will improve efficiencies and then hopefully address affordability issues, keeping in mind that any self-respecting economist will never offer you cheaper prices. They'll offer you more efficient prices. And if that increase in efficiency results in additional cost reflection in the prices, then maybe prices will not decrease in the short term. But also in terms of making sure that the Eskom itself is not rendered completely disabled in the process. And hence these issues like the vesting contracts, the capacity PPAs. So I think these were efforts to ensure that there is a pragmatic approach that protected people from Eskom's market power on one hand, which deals with affordability and prices and for businesses competitiveness of power, but on the other hand also protects Eskom in the short to medium term. They will have to face competition in the long term, but also protects them from literally collapsing and therefore actually placing a greater burden on everybody than if they had been assisted to adapt to market conditions. So I think that for me, and those were constant themes throughout all of the discussions that I've sat in over the last 3 years around the development of the market and the unbundling of Eskom. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mark, and thank you for answering the other questions in the chat as well. I'll now go to Megan, if you'd like to share also your final reflections as we are going to time.
Yeah. So maybe just a couple of things, Zainab. So, picking up also on the FPE story that Dr. Pendile raised, and I think it links to Kinkumalo's question about the backyarders. So just to say, I think there's an enormous amount of work that needs to be done on the ground. I think there is innovation happening there. So I think with backyarders, there's all sorts of innovation in the metering space, the sub-metering space, but there's like a heap of, real door-to-door work that has to be done to get people into the system and registered on the system. And I think the good news is that this is becoming quite a big issue at distribution. SALGA, Department of Energy, are very, very conscious of it. And there is work underway. It's not going to change overnight. We've got 167 licensed municipal distributors. It's incredibly hard to tackle each one. Each one's got different constraints. Sometimes it's governance, sometimes it's admin. It's really huge, but I think it is underway. So I think that's important. And then to say to, I think not only Solly, but I think there were a couple of comments in the chat, Katrina, I really do, I really can relate to and understand and sympathize with this frustrated sense of being sort of forced into something new and different that feels like it's just handing over the family silver to the markets and so on. But I really do want to say that who do the reforms serve? I think we really have to face the fact that that 900% increase in the electricity price happened under a state-owned monopoly and a coal regime. So if you think that that is a panacea, or like it's going back to that is going to sort out all problems, I think that's just not looking at things squarely. I think the other thing is that, and some of the commissioners made reference to this, you need capital to build networks, and you need to be able to borrow that capital if the state can't raise that capital. And our state can't raise that capital, similar to many, many of the states in the region. So we have to borrow capital. Capital is unfortunately something that flows across the world and it goes to places it wants to go to. So it's not like we are you can sort of lay down how we want to do things. If we want capital, we have to be able to attract that capital. And it doesn't, I think that the market reform that's been underway through the NTCSA, through nurses' engagement now with the market code, has been incredibly considered. And these vesting contracts, for example, while we need to monitor them very closely around, and I thought Tracy Lynn's question in the chat was great and Mark's response was great. We need to monitor them. We need to ensure efficiency, but they are really looking at sort of protecting us. And I think we must remember that under the notion that sort of energy is a public good and we can sell it at a socialized cost, you still can't avoid the question then is who pays. So it still has to then come from a taxpayer. You're going to have to still pay for that. So it's not like it just goes away, and there's only so much tax you can sort of get off people before they take their money elsewhere. And then just to say, I think that the opportunity lies. So I think this, I'm going to leave this as a challenge, Zainab. At the moment, the renewable energy sector, to some extent, has been kind of, captured by capital. And I want to throw it as a challenge to people. We've got to capture that for democratic purposes. We've got to make sure that we sort of try to make the systems friendly for very small scale. We want to empower households to move into these spaces, and not just households, but communities. It can be the ultimate kind of power in your hands, literally. So we're a long way off that, but let's make that our challenge rather than sort of trying to go back to hugely centralized top-down utilities, which even just from a technology point of view have sort of passed now. Thanks.
Thank you very much for that final reflection. And as we draw this to a close, I'm going to invite Ms. Leboha Mulaisi from the PCC Secretariat just to help us close off the session, but also share how we'll be taking this forward as a PCC. Over to you, Lebo.
Thank you very much, Commissioner Zainab, and to everybody that attended the session for a very useful discussion on just broader electricity reform that's currently taking place. I think as the Commission, the first 5 years have been around just laying the foundation around the current changes as a result of amendments to the ERA, and what these mean for electricity generation, what these mean for impact on the grid, and then most importantly, what this means for our transition to a low carbon economy, and ultimately what this means in terms of pricing. So there's been rich discussion, and I just want to say thank you to the various speakers that have come on board to provide the necessary context for us to have this conversation, even though this conversation was specifically around the vesting contract framework that's currently out for public comment as released by NERSA for the public to make comments on, but just having a broad conversation in the context of electricity reform has been really useful for the purposes of the commission as well. We probably should have said in the beginning of the session that we're listening in the background, but also taking into consideration the comments that have been posted in the chat to formulate a response or a position back to the colleagues at NERSA so that they can have the views of stakeholders in terms of the comment process on particularly the vesting contract framework. One of the pillars of the just transition is procedural justice, and it's important for stakeholders to be included in sometimes very technical processes that inform the electricity reform process more broadly. But it's through engagements and dialogues of this nature in which we try to get stakeholders more broadly to reflect on what these mean for our transition to a low carbon economy, but what this means for the common man in the streets, what this means for workers, what this means for community members, and what this means for all of us. Because we know that issues related to electricity pricing and just electricity reform touch society in every shape and form and mean a lot, not just for industry, but for consumers as well as community members on the ground. So what we will be doing, I know the official process for NERSA to make comments on this particular vesting contract framework does end tomorrow. But what we will be doing as the PCCs to also, as part of this process, to consolidate stakeholder views to also submit to the colleagues as NERSA as they also apply their minds in terms of setting a fair vesting contract framework. So with that said, I don't want to hold us for too long. I'd like to just say thank you to the chair who's chaired this session quite diligently. We thank you very much for that. I'd like to thank the Simpiwe, our colleague, who has done the framing for us today. Thank you to Mark. We did approach you quite late, but thank you for agreeing to give us the context. It was really useful, and we will make sure to circulate the slides to colleagues. Thank you, Megan, for making the connection to a very techno-economic concept down to what it means in terms of issues related to pricing, which will affect society at large. So we thank you for that. To all of our commissioners who made impacts, Dr. Titus, Commissioner Boitumelo, Commissioner Errol, as well as to you, Dr. Pindile, for coming on board to share your reflections. We really appreciate the insights, and to all the colleagues and participants who joined and made inputs into this process. We look forward to continuing these conversations as more and more reforms as we engage in more of the reforms that are currently taking place. We do want to continue to achieve procedural justice and come back to society and engage with yourselves further as we proceed with this process. So with that said, colleagues, thank you very much for joining us. We look forward to seeing you in the next Energy Dialogue. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Wow.
Bye.